Good morning, everybody, or should I say good afternoon. My name is Ryan Fisher. I'm a member of the Darwin Festival Committee. Welcome to our 47th Annual Darwin Festival here at Salem State University. Our speaker will start their presentation shortly. Please be aware that closed captioning is available by clicking on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. Also, there will be a question and answer period at the end of the talk. You can type in your question at any time during the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The moderators will ask questions of the speaker and may combine questions to ask the speaker. Also, we apologize in advance if your question is not asked due to limited time. If you get bumped out of the webinar, you can quit Zoom and then re-enter the webinar using the link in the email you received after you registered. Each talk and question and answer will fit within one class period. At the end, we will show the QR code after the Q&A period. And in the QR code, you'll be able to add your name, select the talk, and select your professor. An attendance sheet will be sent to each professor afterwards. Remember to please type your questions in the Q&A text box. It now gives me great pleasure to pass the microphone, as it were, over to my colleague in the Geography and Sustainability Department, Professor John Hayes, to make the formal introduction. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Ryan. Really appreciate it. Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for coming today. The Geography and Sustainability Department is honored to host the visit of Dr. Shaina Sadai to the 47th Annual Darwin Festival of Salem State University. Dr. Sadai is an independent scholar in the Five Colleges Consortium in Massachusetts. She received her PhD in geosciences, specializing in geography and climate science from UMass Amherst. She did a postdoctoral fellowship with the Union of Concerned Scientists out of Cambridge, Mass. And her Bachelor of Science degrees are in physics and astrophysics. And then she had a Master of Science in applied math. And all of those degrees are from our UMass Amherst. The Geography and Sustainability Department at Salem State has been hosting an invited speaker at the Darwin Festival since 2002. Hard to imagine, that seems so long ago. And we are very pleased to have Dr. Sadai with us today, and she's continuing this tradition. We also thank the Charles Albert Reed Trust for sponsoring our invited speakers over these past 20 plus years, and absolutely, positively, of course, Geography and Sustainability thanks the Darwin Festival Planning Committee for the opportunity to host a speaker during their wonderful festival. Dr. Sadai is a climate scientist and a critical physical geographer at the Five Colleges. Her research is interdisciplinary. She combines the physical science of future climate change modeling and sea level rise modeling with ecology and social science so that she can analyze climate justice of non-human animals and the implications for advancing kind of a new field, a new branch of climate justice called multi-species climate justice. So again, we are just so thrilled that Dr. Shaina Sadai is with us today to speak on the topic of sea level rise and multi-species climate justice. I will now turn it over to Professor Shaina Sadai.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for hosting me here. So yes, this talk is about multi-species climate justice and sea level rise, and I want to start by acknowledging my amazing co-authors on this work. They're all former undergraduate students of mine who have since graduated. There's Ava Sharpe, Rory Crisfield, Elizabeth Rankin, and Caitlin Bolzan, and I am very grateful to have had such amazing research assistants on this work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start by going over a little bit of sea level science. So my primary background is in climate and sea level science, and then I also do critical physical geography, so that'll be sort of woven in there. And then I'll talk about multi-species climate justice theory, what that is, and then we'll get into the 3 sections of our research chapter that I'm presenting today, which is on the distribution of sea level rise impacts on non-human animals, recognition of diverse forms of life, and adapting to rising sea levels in a way that centers justice for all. Next slide, please. So this project began as this concept for a research project where we would start with a systematic literature review. Basically, we went through 10 years of the published peer-reviewed literature in the fields of ecology and conservation biology and looked for publications on how sea level rise was affecting animal communities. And then we wanted to interpret those results through climate justice theory with a focus on multi-species climate justice. And so the work itself has kind of evolved into 2 different projects. We started with the systematic literature review, but that is going to be a separate publication. And the part that I'm going to present today is the multi-species climate justice interpretation of what we found through the systematic literature review. So I'll reference the systematic review and the research that we drew from on how sea level rise impacts non-human animals, but I'll focus on aspects of climate justice theory that relate to those different case studies. And the chapter that I'm presenting today is part of a forthcoming book that I co-edited called Multi-Species Climate Justice, Liberatory Futures for Human and More Than Human Worlds. And it's co-edited by myself, Sylvia Cifuentes, and Stephanie Rutherford. And I also want to thank the grant funders that supported this work, which is the Culture and Animals Foundation. Very grateful to them. Next slide, please. Okay, so climate change, you're all well familiar with it. Greenhouse gas emissions are occurring, and as a result of greenhouse gas emissions, the composition of the atmosphere is changing. There is an increasing concentration of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases, and that is impacting the radiative balance, that balance between incoming solar energy and outgoing long-wave radiation from the Earth. And as a result of radiation balance shifting from greenhouse gas emissions and rising greenhouse gas concentrations, we have accumulation of heat in the Earth system, which is leading to widespread impacts, which can include heat waves, sea level rise, ocean acidification, intensifying tropical cyclones, and many other detrimental impacts. Greenhouse gas emissions are primarily occurring due to the combustion of fossil fuels, but there's many other sources such as emission sources from animal agriculture, from F-gases that are used in like air conditioning refrigerants, from many other sources. And underlying all of that are systems of oppression and unjust socio-political systems and heavily polluting industries. So emissions don't happen in a vacuum, they happen because of political and economic decisions. And as we are seeing in this plot here of global mean surface temperature over time since 1940, global average temperatures are rising significantly, and that is accelerating in recent decades. We've just had the 3rd warmest year on record. We continue to have record-breaking heat, and it's leading to a lot of detrimental impacts to life on Earth. Next slide, please. So sea level rise is just one of many consequences of climate change, and a little bit about the physical mechanisms of sea level rise. So on average across the Earth, sea levels have risen by about 0.2 meters, only around 8 inches, from 1900 to 2018. This sounds like a small amount, but the impacts of it are quite vast and are impacting shorelines all over the world. And not only is the sea level rising, but the rate at which it's rising is accelerating over time. So even if we look at just the past couple of decades of data, sea level was rising by about 2 millimeters per year in 1992. And at present day, it's rising by more around 4.5 millimeters per year. So more than double the rate in just a little bit of time. And sea level rise also doesn't occur like a bathtub fills up with water, where the water level goes up by the same amount everywhere. Instead, it's highly variable at the regional level due to a complex interplay of different factors that drive sea level rise. And so these plots are just showing some of what that spatial variability of sea level rise looks like. This was from a study that was in 2018 using satellite altimetry data. And you can see in the places where there's darker red around like the tropics, around the western boundary currents, there is higher regional sea level rise in some areas than in others. But the global signal is that, of course, it is on average rising across the Earth. Next slide, please. So the things that are driving sea level rise, of course, is the greenhouse gas emissions leading to the accumulation of heat. And what is that doing? It's causing thermal expansion of the water column. So some of that heat, over 90% of that heat, is going into the oceans. And as that heat enters the oceans, it causes the water column to expand via thermal expansion. And so that's one of the main drivers. And the other main driver is the melting of land ice, meaning the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica and global mountain glaciers. And we can use attribution science to try to figure out how we can attribute the rising sea level to climate change and even to specific types of emission sources. So I'm using an example from one of my own peer-reviewed publications that came out last year, which was about trying to determine the responsibility of industrial fossil fuel polluters to rising sea levels. And so what we found in that study was that over the full historical period that we can trace fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions to, so 1854 to 2020, we can look at fossil fuel emissions over that period and attribute them to just a small number of corporations that are major fossil fuel producers. And so we found in this study that over that time period, we can attribute 24 to 37% of present day sea level rise to emissions from products produced by these carbon majors, so ExxonMobil, Chevron, state-owned companies. And this plot is showing in the darker blue the sea level rise that has occurred up to present day, and in the lighter blue, what would have happened if industrialized fossil fuel development had never happened. So we can clearly see the effects of fossil fuels driving higher sea level rise, and other parts of this study showed that even just those past emissions of fossil fuels produced by the carbon majors will lead to higher sea levels out to the year 2300 and possibly even beyond. Our model only looked out to 2300, but the signal is attributable. Next slide, please. And so if we think about what's happening now and what will happen into the future, globally average sea level rise is going to continue occurring for centuries to millennia. And the ultimate magnitude, how high sea levels will go, will depend on emission scenarios that happen from here into the future. And so this plot is showing that under a high emission scenario, if the world does not act and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we can end up in one of the red scenarios, which is particularly bad, where sea level rises quite significantly. And this plot is only showing out to 2100, but there are other versions of this plot that look out longer. They're just really hard to fit on slides, that show that sea levels will continue going up into the future beyond 2100. But if we contrast the red lines to the blue lines being lower emission scenarios where the world collectively acts to reduce emissions, then yes, sea level still rises, but it rises by a much smaller amount. And that smaller amount of magnitude of sea level rise allows for easier adaptation options. So we want to minimize sea level rise as much as possible by reducing greenhouse gas emissions as soon as we can, because sea level rise is not reversible on human relevant timescales. And so once that sea level goes up, it's going to take a lot to bring it back down. We need heat to come out of the ocean, and we need global regrowth of ice sheets and glaciers. So this is a long-term problem that we need to be thinking about. Next slide, please. And then the impacts of this are, of course, we're familiar with a lot of them: flooding and inundation, extreme sea level events, meaning that storm surges happening on top of already risen sea levels will lead to even worsening flooding impacts. There's also erosion of shorelines, and there is salinification of freshwater. So especially like if we think about freshwater ecologies, like freshwater swamps near coastal spaces, as sea level starts to rise and that salty water gets into a freshwater ecosystem, it starts to change and disrupt the ecosystem. And so all of these types of impacts of sea level rise directly harm animals and disrupt ecosystems and multi-species communities. Next slide, please. And alongside rising sea levels, there's also the other climate impacts. So if we think about an animal a species trying to adapt to sea level rise, they're also trying to adapt simultaneously to other climate change impacts that are occurring, more frequent and severe heat waves, precipitation changes, strengthening tropical cyclones, and other anthropogenic stresses like habitat fragmentation, hunting and poaching, and various types of pollution. Next slide, please. And so I wrote this other paper in 2022, my first climate justice and sea level rise paper, where we looked at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, which is the global agreement to try to get climate change under control. And we thought about the ways that the Alliance of Small Island States, which is a group of island nations that, well, they're not all island nations, but most of them are island nations that work together in international negotiations to push for the strongest possible climate action. And they are often referencing the ways in which they are impacted by sea level rise. And so we use three aspects of climate justice theory in this paper, thinking about distribution, the mismatch between responsibility for emissions and the burdens that are falling on those who are not responsible for emissions, recognition justice, meaning acknowledging the existence rights of diverse people, diverse beings, and diverse ecologies, and then procedural injustices, which is about how the uneven political power dynamics shape responses to sea level rise and can limit options for the strongest and most ambitious climate action. And the plot here is just showing how sea level rise sourced from Antarctica projected into the future, even under a moderate emission scenario, is going to disproportionately impact members of the Alliance of Small Island States, which are all labeled on this map, disproportionately in comparison to their very, very low emissions contribution that they have had over the historical period. So we're drawing from the same justice framework in the multi-species climate justice chapter. Next slide, please. So multi-species climate justice has been an emerging sort of framework. And in 2021, Chacker et al. Wrote a paper sort of like laying out the foundations of multi-species climate justice theory. And they noted two drawbacks in some common climate justice framings, which are that they don't include the voices of multiple types of others. So that could mean other species. And that's what they're referring to in the paper. And that the common climate justice framing should also question human exceptionalism and the violence that it can enact. Next slide, please. And so in that paper, they call for this more inclusive approach, and they state, quote, a multi-species justice lens expands climate justice by decentering the human and recognizing the everyday interactions that bind individuals and societies to networks of close and distant others, including other people and more than human beings. And they stress throughout this paper that they do not mean to like decenter the ways that climate justice must be applied to humans, but they want to not decenter, but expand and have human climate justice and more than human climate justice be integrated together so that we are thinking about humans and the more than human world at the same time. Next slide, please. And I also just want to shout out this very excellent artistic piece. It's a multimedia storytelling project on multi-species climate justice. It's done by some friends of mine that is an artist collective in Romania. It's called We Fly, We Crawl, We Swim. And it's just a really beautiful film about this concept. So I highly recommend everyone check it out. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting into the three main portions of our chapter here. So we start with the distribution aspect of it. So distributive justice would be even distributions of burdens and benefits in any particular situation. And when we think about the injustices of sea level rise, wealthy and powerful humans have driven greenhouse gas pollution while systematically marginalized humans and more than human communities bear the burdens. So there is a mismatch in the distribution of burdens and benefits here. Benefits meaning like, you know, corporations that are making a lot of money from greenhouse gas pollution, and burdens obviously meaning flooding and inundation from sea level rise. Next slide, please. So this is all drawing from the systematic literature review, and these are some examples that we found when we were looking at all the peer-reviewed literature on how animals are impacted by sea level rise. This first example is taking a bit of a paleoclimate view and thinking about what's happening at present day. So this is the case of the African penguin. African penguins live off of the coast of South Africa on islands that are around that southern region. And the African penguin experienced detrimental population declines as a result of the sea level rise that occurred following the last glacial maximum. And so these plots are showing from 22,000 years ago on the left-hand side to present day on the right-hand side, where the top panel is showing how sea level rose as the last deglaciation occurred. And then the second panel is showing how island area started to decline as sea levels rose because those islands were becoming more permanently inundated. And the third panel shows the population of the African penguins declined significantly as sea level started to rise following the last deglaciation. And so they had significant population impacts due to sea level rise, but a portion of the population was able to survive and adapt, and they did that by moving to other islands. So they sort of redispersed amongst the islands that were still available to them as sea level started to rise. But now at present day, they are vulnerable to the current sea level rise and also to other stresses like attacks from outdoor cats, other types of pollution. And so those impacts also have to be taken into account. And so the moral of this story is that resilience of a population of a species to past sea level change does not guarantee resilience to present and future sea level rise. Adaptation assistance may be needed in cases like this and other conservation efforts to try to safeguard the African penguin population. Next slide, please. Other distributive impacts that we found were around salinification of freshwater. And so these are two examples, the first being the melon barb fish, which lives in rivers in South India. And they experience high levels of stress from rising salinity. So they start to experience respiratory dysfunction and various types of physiological stress that can lead to death of the melon barb fish. And another example was saltwater crocodiles, which, you know, the name implies that they are adapted to evolve to be able to live in saltwater, but they also rely on freshwater swamps. Those are especially important during their reproductive cycle, so they need freshwater swamps for breeding and nesting. But those freshwater swamps are increasingly being threatened by sea level rise as that salty ocean water starts to degrade the freshwater swamp, and the salinity intrusion is impacting population numbers currently. So those are two examples of how salinification is impacting more than human animals. Next slide, please. Another thing that came up a lot in our systematic literature review was the importance of how sea level rise is impacting migration routes. So the way that animals use space can change throughout the year, and especially for species that have long distance migrations, they're particularly vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise. So this is looking at the Asian Australasian flyway, which is a particularly important region in the Pacific for migratory birds. And along their flyway route are many, many islands. And so each of those stopover points that is used by a particular species, they have to be able to rest and they have to be able to find food. But as some of those islands start to be impacted by sea level rise, and as some of them could even become permanently inundated, they can no longer be effective stopover points, which forces the population to change their migration routes or forces into bottleneck points where a large percentage of the population might have to pass through one remaining island stopover point space in a particular area as they go. And so this study from Iwamura et al. And several other studies showed that long distance migratory shorebirds can have significant population reductions as sea level rise starts to impact their migratory stopover points. Next slide, please. And along this idea of island stopover points and island impacts, atolls are particularly at risk. So atolls are very low-lying islands that are created from former volcanic calderas, and they have elevations that can max out at like 10 feet, so very, very flat. And they also have freshwater lenses, which are their source of freshwater, and so particularly important. And so atolls are at risk for permanent inundation, but even before permanent inundation occurs, that salinity intrusion and also storm surge impacts can impact populations that live in atolls. Next slide, please. And extreme sea level events, which are from storm surge flooding usually, can cause particularly detrimental impacts. So there's the mean sea level, there's the high tide and low tide, and then when a tropical cyclone comes in, there's also the storm surge as the storm pushes water up onto the shore. And if storm surge happens to occur during a high tide, then you have even higher impacts. And as the average sea level starts to rise, all of these things get worse and worse. And then simultaneous to a extreme sea level event, you also have heavy precipitation and high winds. So these are particularly difficult things to deal with. Next slide, please. And to give an example of how storm surge flooding impacts animal communities, this is the flying foxes of Micronesia. So Micronesia is in the Pacific, sort of near the Philippines, alongside the coast of Asia. And the flying foxes are starting to experience impacts to their roosting sites. They rely on breadfruit trees as one of their primary food sources and also for roosting sites. And the breadfruit trees are being impacted by repeated storm surge flooding. And over the long term, the flying foxes are projected to experience significant habitat loss as all of these situations start to deteriorate, and the atolls are already so low lying. So this is a particularly difficult type of situation to deal with. Next slide, please. And then some other impacts that came up through the systematic literature review are storm surge flooding as it impacts a very small species that live really close to coastal areas and don't travel far. And these are three different coastal species that we found were impacted: the Florida moleskink, the Alabama beach mouse, and the Florida reef gecko, all of which are at risk from widespread habitat inundation during strong tropical cyclones. Next slide, please. And one impact that we were not expecting to find was rocky cliff collapse. And so this was an impact of erosion. We found this study looking at green sea turtles in the Red Sea off the on the coastline of Saudi Arabia. The turtles come on shore to nest, but as erosion is impacting the rocky areas around the coast near where their nesting sites are, they found that there was significant turtle mortality due to rocky cliff collapses. And so this was an impact of sea level rise that we had not even expected to find when we started out doing the systematic literature review. Next slide, please. So moving from distribution to recognition. So researching these impacts of sea level rise on animal communities is particularly important so that we understand what is occurring. But within the conservation literature more broadly, we also wanted to point out that there is like unevenness in who gets studied and where they get studied. So within the conservation literature broadly, there's an underrepresentation of insect communities, of amphibians, and of invertebrates. And there's also a geographic bias in the literature where there's relatively few studies from Africa and South Asia and more studies that have occurred in North and Central America and in Europe. But we also want to point out that the conservation literature also shows that study alone is insufficient for enacting for ensuring survival and conservation success. So one example being that marine invertebrates are understudied, but marine vertebrates like sea turtles that are studied remain threatened despite the attention that they receive. So next slide, please. So recognition is a piece of the puzzle. Recognition justice means respecting the existence rights of everyone, all living beings. And shorelines, as we started to think about this research, we were thinking about the concept of sacrifice zones and how shorelines can run the risk of becoming sacrifice zones to sea level rise, and the importance of recognizing that coastal space and the need to preserve the safety of all inhabitants, human and more than human alike, in the coastal zone. Next slide, please. So in the recognition justice section of the paper, we concentrate on the case study of the first documented extinction due to climate change, which occurred in the Torres Strait. So the Torres Strait is this marine area between Papua New Guinea and Australia. And the part that's labeled in red is Mazab Kaur, also known as Bramble Cay. This is, so this region is called the Torres Strait, and that Mazab Kaur is an island within the Torres Strait. The area is inhabited by the indigenous Torres Strait Islanders, but it is administered politically by Australia. And it's an area that's experiencing really high rates of sea level rise, higher than the global average, so more like 6 millimeters per year versus the current average of 4 millimeters per year. So this shows the importance of taking into account regional variability in sea level rise impacts. Next slide, please. And so the Mazab Kaura mukis was a small rodent that is also known as the Bramble Cay Melonis. They lived exclusively on that Mazab Kaur island. And there were several hundred individuals of the mukis that were alive in the 1970s. Conservation biologists documented them at that time. The Torres Strait Islanders documented them at that time. And by 2004, there was only a couple dozen individuals of the species left. And the reason for that was repeated storm surge flooding, erosion, and salinity stresses. And that combination of factors led to the decline of 97% of the island's vegetation. The vegetation is important because the mukis needed it for both food and for shelter. So as the vegetation started to decline, the mukis started to decline, and that shows that relationality between animal and plant communities. Next slide, please. And so a recovery plan was drafted because clearly this was something that was recognized that was happening, that there was a steep population decline due to sea level rise. But that recovery plan was never put into action. So a conservation action plan that just wasn't enacted. And ultimately, the mukis was declared extinct in 2016, but the last individuals probably perished before that, sometime between 2009 and 2014. Next slide, please. And when we talked about this in the paper, we drew a little bit from Blanche Verley, who is a multi-species climate justice scholar, who wrote a paper in 2022 about aspirational climate justice, aspiration meaning like breathing. And she conceptualizes in the paper breathing as a process being relational between polluters, those rendered vulnerable, and the climate itself. And so when we were thinking about what the mukis had experienced, many individuals drowned during storm surge flooding events, and drowning stops breathing. So it is an aspirational injustice, we claim in our chapter, due to the greenhouse gas pollution and the lack of recognition of the survival needs of the mukis. And we also drew from Alexis Pauline Gumbs's work in this part of the chapter. Alexis Pauline Gumbs wrote the book Undrowned: Black Feminist Lessons for Marine Mammals, where she also talks about breathing. And this is a quote from it. "What's the scale of breathing? All animals participate in this exchange of release for continued life, but not without the plants. The plants in their inverse process release what we need, take what we give without being asked, and the planet wrapped in ocean, breathing into the sky. And if the scale of breathing is collective, beyond species and sentience, then so is the impact of drowning." So we talked about this as being clearly a climate injustice that the Mazab Kaur mukis and the entire multi-species community of the Torres Strait was dealing with. Next slide, please. And so the Torres Strait community, the mukis would have required adaptation assistance and probably some form of human-assisted relocation. And that required funding from the government of Australia, which did not come through. But the local Torres Strait Islanders had they loved the mukis. It was an important part of the multi-species community. And there's a local artist collective there called Arab Arts, and they created this artwork to draw attention to the case of the mukis and the need for safeguarding the remaining inhabitants of the Torres Strait. So all of this artwork are members of the collective created it out of found materials made from beach debris, so like discarded nets that wash up on shore and other types of marine debris, and they made these beautiful artworks, which they have shown in many art shows, and they also have an Instagram page and they share it online. Next slide, please. And this is a quote from Jimmy John Thaddeus, one of the artists in the Arab Arts Collective, where he says, "The sand cay is sacred for us Thaddeus. We have to try to maintain the bank because it's washing away. Since the Malomas is gone, the next best thing we can do is look after the turtles. And with climate change, all the nests near the water are starting to wash out." So using the artwork to bring attention to the needs for multi-species climate justice within the Torres Strait community, both for the islanders themselves and for the turtles and for the other inhabitants of the multi-species community there. Next slide, please. And so the Torres Strait Islanders have taken a lot of action in a lot of different ways, including through the legal system. They had this case in 2022 with the United Nations Human Rights Committee, where they alleged that the government of Australia was violating their human rights by continuing to produce greenhouse gases. And this is part of the testimony. Keith Pabai was one of the people in this case. He is the one in the bottom right with the purple shirt and the red floral. He says, "I know every species of plant, animal, and wind on the island, the way the vegetation changes, what to harvest at different times of year. That is the cultural inheritance that we teach our children." So it was a crucial part of them making the case to the UN Human Rights Committee that they need the multi-species community and that the land, the animals, and the people are all integrally connected, and that high polluters are impacting their rights to live safely. They won this case, but as yet, Australia has taken insufficient action. And so this is seen as a huge win for climate justice, but the actual implementation of the ruling is yet to be fully realized. Next slide, please. So moving from recognition to action. So the loss of the Mazab Kauramukis is a warning for the impacts of recognitional and procedural injustices. There was the failure to adapt the conservation adaptation plan, which led to the extinction. And there's also been Australia's now failure to comply with the United Nations Human Rights Committee ruling. And both of those are procedural injustices, some sort of power differentials within the decision-making process led to there not being sufficient action. And so when we think about adaptation to sea level rise and the action that needs to be taken, that is based in political decisions. Whose interests are being protected, what resources are available, and how are they being allocated? How are these decisions being made? Next slide, please. And so this procedural justice is equitable and inclusive decision-making processes, and then injustice is whenever power is wielded by some to the detriment of others. Next slide, please. And so when we drew out the framework for how we wanted the last part of the chapter to be when we were thinking about adaptation and procedural justice, we drew heavily from Angie Pepper's work on adapting to climate change, what we owe other animals. Angie Pepper is an applied philosopher, and she had these 4 tenets of how to assist non-human animals in adaptation to climate change. And the first thing was ensuring that human-built environments protect all who live there, regardless of species. The second thing is not to jeopardize adaptation responses of freely living animals. The third thing is to remove human barriers to autonomous animal adaptations. And the fourth thing is to facilitate the adaptation of non-human animals who cannot autonomously adapt for whatever reason. Next slide, please. So under that first one, adaptation for all, thinking about common sea level rise adaptation options, there's often the construction of hardscaping. So this is things like sea walls or other physical barriers for the water. There's also relocation, which is usually an absolute last resort because almost no one wants to be forced to have to relocate due to climate change. And then there's also ecosystem-based adaptation, which is a much more inclusive approach and generally does take into account the multi-species communities to some extent. But we also need to think about how adaptation for all really means adaptation for all, for humans, for non-human communities. And so hardscaping adaptation projects, we drew from this paper by Domingue and that was published in 2022, Simone Domingue, which was looking at how hardscaping adaptation projects in coastal Louisiana have harmed Black and Indigenous communities in the bayous and also simultaneously harmed the local ecology. Next slide, please. And so one example is from Terrebonne Parish. where Louisiana communities that felt sidelined in the adaptation planning process teamed up with biologists to try to find more inclusive solutions. And this is one quote from one of those projects. "It's not just land that we're restoring habitat. There's a plethora of life besides human life that's dependent on these places, the microscopic life, the insect populations, the mammals, the birds, the nesting birds, the marine population. All of these are dependent on the land that we restore." So they are talking about taking more inclusive approaches that center all who live there. And in the Domingue paper, when they were talking about people feeling sidelined in adaptation processes, a lot of the ways that those adaptation measures were being pushed forward in political spaces were by focusing on the greater good, focusing on the broadest needs. But when you have the social construction of the greater good, communities that are already marginalized can be pushed to the side. So this is trying to push back against that and find more inclusive approaches. Next slide, please. And there were a few really excellent examples of adaptation initiatives that center adaptation for all. One of my favorites is the Wampum Adaptation Framework. This is from Shinnecock scholar Kelsey Leonard and was published in 2020. So she's a member of one of the Northeast tribal communities, and she put together this framework for sea level rise adaptation that centers Indigenous viewpoints, where it's witnessing the natural world, both human and non-human relations, acknowledging the traditional teachings, mending the shoreline, saying environmental sovereignty, protecting future generations, uniting with other communities to build capacity, and moving only as a last resort. And so this is a great example of a framework for adaptation that takes into account all who live in the space. Next slide, please. And this is one other example, is restoration of coastal spaces using Hawaiian indigenous lo'i techniques. And these can actually expand water bird habitats and counter the space that is being lost by sea level rise. And so these are traditional agroecological practices, and they can contribute to the recovery of water birds that are presently endangered. That's what the modeling from this paper from Harmon et al. Showed. So this is another way of looking at adaptation planning that is centering both human and more than human communities. Next slide, please. I think I'm running out of time, but I only have a few slides left. So the second tenet from Angie Pepper's work was about an autonomous adaptation. And so one example of this that we found in the systematic literature review was that of the silver rice rat, which lives in the lower Florida Keys. So they were monitored over 17 years. And over that time, sea level was, of course, rising in the Florida Keys. But the rice rats enacted their own autonomous adaptations by moving to higher elevations as the sea level started to rise. But one thing that we want to point out in the paper is that, yes, that has worked over these timescales, this 17-year timescale, but sea level rise, the rate is accelerating, as I said earlier, and without emissions reductions, this type of autonomous adaptation is not sustainable in the long term because there's only so high you can go. You reach the highest elevation if the sea level keeps rising because the emissions reductions have not occurred, then you're still going to have negative impacts. And so we wanted to note here that we should learn from what happened to the Mazahcalramukis and try to prevent losses of beings like the silver rice rat and the Alabama beach mouse. Next slide, please. The third tenet from Angie Pepper was about removing barriers. And so maladaptation is this concept that you can enact adaptation measures, but sometimes they have harmful outcomes. And so maladaptation is the term for when an adaptation project causes harm. Next slide, please. And so one example of this is seawalls that are constructed on the coast of Florida. So sea turtles need to use beaches for their nests, but if seawalls are constructed, then the turtles often can't get as high up onto the beaches as they want to go. And so they end up making their nests closer to the shoreline in front of the seawalls. But that is a place where overwash is going to hit the wall, wash back out the nests. And so this has significant negative impacts on nesting sea turtles. And so we use this as an example that removing some of these barriers and replacing them with an ecosystem-based adaptation project would be a much more inclusive approach. Next slide, please. And also in the section on removing barriers, we wanted to note that we don't just mean constructed barriers like seawalls, we also mean political barriers, the political boundaries, and we need cross-border assistance to allow for migration. Natural migration should be the right of all humans and more than human beings, but the construction, enforcement, and securitization of political borders is obviously having profound detrimental impacts on the natural migratory movements of humans and of more than human communities. So we call for recognizing the fact that securitization of political borders has numerous harmful impacts on both humans and more than human animals. Next slide, please. And then the last tenet from Angie Pepper was about adaptation assistance. So this would have been what the Mazahkawramukis needed, would have been adaptation assistance to move. They couldn't have naturally moved themselves to a new island. They would have required human assistance for that. And the giant tortoises that live in the Seychelles are also candidates for migration assistance. They're very large, they're slow moving. They cannot necessarily move to another island on their own, but they can be moved with assistance if needed. However, some of the places that they were moved to, they're also experiencing other threats like poaching. So this is about, really thinking about holistic approaches and how to minimize the harm, and also noting that migration is almost always going to be a last resort. So like it would be much better to prevent sea level rise, prevent the worst extents of sea level rise than to have to enact relocations and things like that. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to sum up, we were thinking about the way that the distribution of sea level rise burdens was impacting different species, and that we need a broader understanding of how these changes are occurring and what species are being impacted by them. And then we need a relational lens on ecological diversity that is recognizing the existence rights of all diverse beings, of humans, of more than human beings, of everyone, and then representation in law and policy spaces to allow for planning for adaptation, and of course, interdisciplinary collaborations and outreach. And then next slide, please. And so I just wanted to point out here some sea level rise advocacy. Sea level rise responses. Island and coastal communities are always talking about impacts of sea level rise. And I want to go back to what I said at the start, that the Alliance of Small Island States has been one of the strongest voices within international negotiations pushing for strong climate action. They are the ones who came up with the phrase 1.5 to stay alive, talking about limiting temperature rise and getting that more ambitious goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius enshrined within the Paris Agreement. I also want to point out the advocacy of Vanuatu, who brought the climate change advisory opinion case to the International Court of Justice. I worked directly on that case. And I also worked directly on the case of the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law, which brought a advisory opinion case to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And within all of these, the testimony that was submitted by islanders always gets back to the fact that they are part of multi-species communities, and that the land, the animals, and the people are all interconnected and all need to be thought of inclusively. So these are just some advocacy efforts that are currently occurring. And then the last slide just has my contact information. Thank you all for listening.
So everybody, if you have any questions while Dr. Brown, who's just done what I was about to ask him, stop sharing the slides, please post them on the Q&A. Anyone who is in the panel with us, the Q&A won't work for us. So Professor Hayes, if you have questions, you'll have to ask them directly. But
Absolutely.
Jason, should I kick off with one question?
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you.
So Dr. Sadai, the first question I have is from William, and I think you may have mentioned a little bit about this right at the start, but his question is, how is sea level rise actually measured?
Yeah, that's a great question. So traditionally it was measured by like tide gauges, but those only get data from specific specific coastal locations, and the coverage of tide gauges is very uneven and has like different geographic spread and different temporal spread in different regions. But nowadays, within the last couple of decades, we've really moved towards measuring a lot with satellite altimetry, which is using radar altimeters to measure the height of the ocean's surface. And so that's really expanded our ability to see sea level rise as it's occurring globally at all parts of the ocean rather than just at specific tidal locations.
Great. I have a question here from Sarah, who says, I know you mentioned that some species are most affected by climate change and habitat changes due to sea level rise. Can you kind of remind us about some of the species that are being harmed again? And then sort of a follow-up, how can we start to make a difference? What are the small first steps that we can do?
Yeah, these are great questions. So within our study, when we were looking through the systematic literature review, we were looking for any publications within the conservation and ecology literature where sea level rise and a particular species were mentioned. And so some of the ones we found were like the silver rice rat, the Alabama beach mouse, the Florida reef gecko, green sea turtles. There's a lot of different species that are being impacted in different ways. Some of them are being impacted by salinity intrusion. Some of them are being impacted by storm surge flooding. And so there's a really big diversity of what species are being impacted. And in terms of advocacy efforts, I think the same with all types of climate change advocacy is like to keep talking about it, to keep forming like collective responses. So student organizing groups are great for this. Political organizing groups can be great for this. And to just keep talking about the need for the three main types of action around climate change: greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, stopping the production of greenhouse gas emissions by like noting specifically what their sources are, like the carbon majors, and to push for emissions reductions. And then the second piece is pushing for adaptation responses. And this can even happen on a local level. So thinking about like how is sea level rise impacting your own communities and what types of responses are already being enacted and how can you help out there? And then the third response to climate change is around loss and damage. So recognizing the fact that adaptation is not going to be able to prevent all harms and some loss and some damage is going to occur. And how do you get restitution when those losses and damages start to happen? Usually there needs to be some sort of financial compensation. So just to keep talking about all of these things and thinking about the ways that you can work with other people that share your thoughts on this and to try to build power together.
Great. I have the next question, but before I ask it, just to remind all the students in the webinar, once the Q&A is completed, we will share the QR code for you to register your attendance. So I have a question from Derek. Has there been, to your knowledge, another documented extinction from climate change other than the bramblecue melamies?
That's a really good question. I think that there has been another one, but I do not remember the specifics off the top of my head, and I'm so sorry about that. It's a really good question, though.
I have a question from one of our colleagues asking, is your work part of this? This is from Len Fletcher. Is your work part of the Center for Breeding Indigenous Knowledges and Science at UMass?
Oh, that's a good question. So it's not specifically that center. Some of my former, like my former PhD advisor is one of the people that's involved in that, but that center got funded right after I left the institution. So I have not been involved with it. That sort of like came into being as I was leaving to go to the Union of Concerned Scientists. So I'm not directly involved, but I think it's a wonderful thing that they now have going on there. And yeah, it's really great. Maybe I will be in the future if I end up, circling back to UMass or something.
I have two questions that I'm going to combine because they're very similar from Kathia and Gracie. What can we do now in the short term, and what can we do in the long term to help protect animals from sea level rise?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a specific geographic thing. Like the impacts in a particular location are going to be so so centered on that location. So I think like globally talking about the need for emissions reductions, because that is the thing that will limit the severity of sea level rise. But there's also, I want to also talk about like compassionate conservation, and that sort of movement. I think that's a really great movement that's happening. You can look at places like the Wild Animal Initiative. I used to be on their like advisory board type thing. They are thinking about ways of enacting conservation with like an approach centered on the individual experiences of animals rather than just on the collective species. So both things simultaneously, conservation of the species and the lived experiences of individual animals under climate change. So I would recommend checking out the Wild Animal Initiative and the compassionate conservation movement to think about how to limit suffering. And then what can we do now versus in the long term? I mean, climate change is going to continue to occur throughout our lifetimes. Like there's never a stopping point in our advocacy. We're always pushing towards climate justice and towards minimizing the harm for all. So the things that we can do now are set up communities of care for ourselves also, because doing that work is really hard and it can come with, mental health challenges, especially when what we see happening in the political sphere does not align with the type of climate action that we want to be seeing. So I think setting up ways for you to take action collectively, but also ways to take care of each other while taking action.
Love that. Yeah.
So this question is from Stephen. You mentioned some species being ignored, like insects and other invertebrates. Can you provide any examples from the literature on sea level and ecosystem change impacts on those kinds of ignored species?
Yeah, we had a tough time. Like we kept looking for specific impacts to insects and not having the easiest time finding them. We ended up finding like one or two papers that referenced insects. And one thing that I was thinking about was I absolutely love monarch butterflies. And as I was thinking about bird migration routes, I was thinking about monarch migration routes and the ways that like when monarchs have to cross ocean space as sea level rise starts to happen, the land is lost, the extent of the ocean that they have to fly over without stopping gets longer. And I was like, has anyone written about this? And I could only find one like little USGS publication that even mentioned that monarch butterflies could be impacted by sea level rise. So I think like there is just like more to be studied in a lot of these places and for a lot of these species. And then when we were doing the systematic literature review, we found a lot of publications on broader ecosystem change, and we excluded those from our final search. We found thousands and thousands of papers in our literature research, and so we had to make exclusion criteria. So we focused on ones that named specific species rather than a broader ecosystem change. I'm not sure if that actually answered the question, but that's what came to mind for me when thinking about that.
I have a question from Noel, one of John's colleagues in the Geography and Sustainability Department. How does sea level rise challenge the national sovereignty of small island nation states, especially when land loss, population displacement, and external control over adaptation or relocation decisions threaten their political economy and legal status as independent states? And this is in the context of, especially when it comes to the country's rights to sue for climate change.
Yeah, so this is an excellent question. So I wrote about this a little bit in my 2022 paper on the Alliance of Small Island States and climate justice issues within the UNFCCC. So there's a little bit about that there, but so much has happened since I published that paper in 2022. And so I want to point out for the answer to this question that it lies in the advisory opinion that was issued by the International Court of Justice last summer. And that opinion, the island nations that brought that case to the ICJ specifically brought this up, the idea of national sovereignty, and if sovereignty is lost as places have the potential to be permanently inundated. And the ICJ opinion says that sea level rise does not impact national sovereignty. So within the ICJ case, national sovereignty should be absolutely not impacted by sea level rise. Like nations should not lose their national sovereignty, even if they lose their land. However, what that means in practice is very much an open question after the issuance of that advisory opinion. And so there's a lot of people thinking about this, that the AO just came out a couple months ago. And since the AO does say that sea level rise doesn't impact national sovereignty, but the reality of the situation is so detrimental, this is like an open question that we now have legal guidance on, but that we're going to be needing follow-up litigation and other types of things to look at. And also, I'm just going to plug that I have a commentary piece out in Nature Climate Change from this past fall on the advisory opinion cases and the need for epistemic plurality and epistemic diversity.
All right. Do we have time for one more question, you think, Ryan?
Yeah, one more, definitely. Just
All right.
one more.
So this question is from Taylor, who says, who decides which species get legal protection globally? Government agencies, scientists, NGOs, and how can someone nominate a newly identified endangered species? And practically, are protections usually limited to whole species, or can they cover subspecies, local populations, or microbes? And how is that boundary determined?
Okay, so this is a really good question, but I don't know the specific
That's
answer.
big.
I'm not a conservation biologist, but I would say the IUCN is probably the place to check like how species get added to the IUCN and then how that gets taken seriously on a national or subnational basis is varies pretty widely across different political climates. So I don't think I have a specific and satisfying answer to this question, but I think it's a really good question.
Really good.
John, I'll
Big.
pass it back to you to formally thank Dr. Sadai, and then I'll share the QR code for our students.
All righty. Well, thank you, Shaina. Just what a stimulating talk for the students in the audience. Just this to see the intersection that you brought together of climate change impacts, sea level rise impacts, ecology globally and specific, and then this social and political justice component. For the students, that this is the real world. It's interdisciplinary, and we benefit from this approach and this training and this approach. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Shaina Sadai. We're just thrilled to have you here. I'd like to thank the audience for their questions. I just was great to hear all those questions, my colleagues and students. What a great afternoon webinar. So thanks again.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you so much for having me.